So, it makes me really wonder, like, really, truly, what is it going to take, right? Like, we know around issues of climate change and sustainability and equity in the workplace, and equity in how we think about just living up to our full potential. There's a lot at stake right now, but I also feel in some ways there's a large portion of America that still is in denial that all of these things are happening simultaneously. Not to even mention, then you throw a pandemic on top of that.
I completely agree with you. I think where I see, now I'm trying to be positive and optimistic because we're living in gloom and doom. Where I see a wedge moment really is around around racial justice. This is a moment, and I see in sectors and movements a whole reckoning with race and how we have incorporated race or not really in our work, both at the movement level in law and policy. And I think that is where I feel we can make change and necessary change. And if you think of the systemic nature of racism and sexism, it is a lens through which we can try to change both. And I have never before seen this kind of conversation, discussion, and the number of forums I'm in and people asking to talk about this, as well as institutions and movements, whether you're talking about reproductive health, rights, the environment, women's movement also is being called to answer these questions. That's where I think there is space for movement, definitely, but in a polarized country, right? So you're speaking, but even it's interesting. Do I have a choir to speak to on race justice? Really, most of us in the choir are people of color. And now we are getting more white people engaged and woke to the scale and magnitude of racism and how it underlies our systems and structures. I do not see an equivalent conversation around gender. I do not. However, this can be a wedge because we live in an intersectional world. People like me are both people of color and women. So I think that people like us will be raising these issues with the understanding that this is all part of a system that has a lot of fundamental flaws and a need to reconstruct.
I'm Jan Risher-Dahms, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. We are an ecosystem of brands for women by women, connecting women to each other and to the companies, causes, and organizations that champion equity for women professionally and personally. Today, you are here with us watching our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion show brought to you each and every Tuesday. Please make sure to join our YouTube channel at Join Mayshad, where you can stay up to date on all of our insanely timely, relevant content, and make sure to check our website at joinmayshad.com to learn about how you too can become a member of how we revolutionize how professional women connect, engage, and do business together. I'm incredibly thrilled and honored to be sharing the stage today with a woman who has spent her entire career advocating for social justice issues. Anika Raman, welcome. Hi, Anika.
Hi, Jan. So nice to be here and to be in conversation with you.
Absolutely. You and I have so many incredible intersectionalities of interests. And I just want to tell our viewers today that you're currently the Chief Board Relations Officer for the Natural Resources Defense Council. We have so much to talk about. You've dedicated, like I said, your career to really advocating for human rights across many different spaces where in the past we may have thought of those spaces as being very siloed. But what we see right now is this really unique moment and opportunity and time to think about the intersectionality of things as it pertains to the environment, social justice, women, people of color. At the beginning of our conversation, you were mentioning how when you think about, the wedges across and between many of these issues that seemingly are very apparently interlocking. You mentioned that gender is one space where there's still an obvious gap. Let's talk a bit more about that and why you think that is.
Yeah, I've been an advocate for women, and I came into the field as a lawyer for human rights and for women's reproductive health and equality and gender. Women, the inequality of women, sexism is one of the inherent pillars of the society we have constructed. Most societies in the world are unequal. period, end of story. One can pick out some small groups I've heard. Oh, you hear about that group in South India that's maternal. It's a maternal culture and women and power. Okay. With those minor exceptions, it requires a rethinking of the world when you're talking about the equality of women and you're talking about gender issues. The same is actually true of race. We have a moment of profound crisis around race because we are seeing Black people being killed and it's being captured. It's very visceral and it is, it's almost impossible to deal with and accept complicity in a system that is so racist, right? There's nothing parallel to that for women. The Me Too movement happened, yes, it's great. And what I'm trying to say is that these are connected issues, and I see inequality and the climate crisis as the key challenges of our time. The earth is warming. People's lives are going to be dramatically changed, and we're going to lose lives and livelihoods. And it's going to be women, people of color, and marginalized people who are going to feel the greatest effect of all of this negativity that's going on and be impacted by politically and socially. Climate change is here. The crisis is here.
So many questions to ask you. Do you feel in a way we may be at a point of no return as we think about climate change? And I'm asking particularly this year, as we see the impacts of the fires, for example, on the West Coast, which are raging out of control. We see the impact of, the incredible number of hurricanes that have already presented themselves. We're not even at the end of hurricane season yet. We see the continued warming of the planet, where every year is the hottest on record. And then just in the way that we think about, everything from accessibility to water to food production and, all those other things as well. Do you feel like we could still turn that around?
I think we can turn it around. We will not, it requires a fundamental shift in our behavior, societal behavior, and government support for it, right? It requires, there are ways of adaptation. I believe that we are a very innovative species. However, in order to mitigate its effects, we need to take dramatic action. We need to call out the fossil fuel industry. We live in a world that is fossil fuel based. Cars, honestly, we don't hardly have enough electric cars, the homes we live in. And the crisis is already occurring. There are nations in the world, island nations, that are already losing land, culture, and people. Islands off the coast of Bangladesh that have already gone under, people's livelihoods. We have, air pollution all around the world that is detrimentally impacting poor people and women and children and communities of color. So this is where that intersectionality comes in, and it is something that we need to address. And it is actually, I will say this, it is the consumption patterns of mainly industrialized nations that have gotten us to this point. The carbon footprint, as you know, say this, you and I live in New York City, of a Manhattanite is far greater than that of a person in the island nation who is losing land and culture and their own family.
And that's true even though most New Yorkers don't have cars, right? And so you think about the way in which then that's compounded by, the way that you live your life across America. I want to go back to one thing that just reminded me when we were talking about gender. And, at Mayshad, it's a diverse group of corporate executives, business owners, entrepreneurs, really diverse across race and ethnicity and age and sexuality. But when we think about, the way in which we talk about feminism, for example, I can't help but think about going back to the second wave of feminist movement, right? And and I just saw your facial expression, so I know you know what I'm talking about here. In what ways has the feminist movement in totality over time helped advance the advancement of women, and in what ways has it hindered it, particularly through the race and ethnicity lens, from your perspective, and where is an opportunity now to broaden how that movement appeals to others?
It's a great question, Jan. As you know, I was the head of the Ms. Foundation for Women, so hey, I lived this question in a very real way. And I would say that second wave feminism, as you know, is painted as being a white women's version of feminism, upper middle class women, and not incorporating the wealth of ethnicities and races that women in our country have always lived with, and third wave and fourth wave, and then also being broad about gender identity, and to realize that we fought for a world that would be fluid, that was not just about binary genders. I think that this is really a moment. Feminism has certainly advanced and helped, and feminism can be reclaimed by all of us. It does not need to be the feminism of a particular race or class. Feminism, just like I would say being anti-racist, is a fundamental reorientation of the world, a fundamentally different vision that is based on equality. And we can all live into it. And I believe it is a clarion call, because look at what we are living in this world, where women, you know, are some of the poorest in the world. There is inequality within women and between women and men in the binary world. And then for those people, for those communities who are not binary, that's a whole other question about how marginalized they are. So I think for me, feminism has been a clarion call. It's just having to redefine it to include everybody's experiences and that intersectionality that you and I were talking about.
I mean, in large part, what we're seeing right now is the way in which power is shifting, right? And, you know, what are the learning lessons that we can take away from what we see happening at the day-to-day level to become more effective leaders, coupled with the fact that, you know, in a large part, this country was founded on individual rights. So when we think about the rights of the individual, and from my perspective, that's a very different conversation than when I think about human rights and what do human rights mean to me. Let's tease that out a bit. Like, what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting. There's so many questions and so many layers in what you said, Jan. The one I'll take first is this idea of power mapping. And I was actually in a webinar speaking, I think 2 days ago, about how power mapping is crucial. And what do I mean by that? Right? I think it gets to the core of issues. I don't think, let me just say out first, there is no law, policy, practice that does not have, that has equal impact on everybody. I challenge you to give me an example of one. So when there is any such thing, whether it's law, policy, practice, and you're thinking, even in your workplace, who does that impact? Who is benefiting from that practice? Who is not? That is what I call power mapping. Always ask the question. And that leads you down pathways that you will find unexpected, right? Who is in the room? Who is not in the room? I'm so used to being the only the person of color in a room. I'm so used to often earlier in my career being the only woman. Now I work in the nonprofit sector. I find we women are there, but are we there with the same voice and power? Are we shaping the table? Like people say, oh, you know, we need a seat on the table. But I say, no, you know, you bring the right people in the room. We'll decide whether we sit on the floor, whether we sit on the table. We will reshape the conversation on the table. And I think the only way to get there is what I call by power mapping and asking yourself that question.
How do we ensure that we're, as leaders, as owners, as, you know, people who are innovating, check ourselves at the door before we enter the room, in the sense of understanding the way in which our own unconscious biases may be impacting those that we work with, that we serve, et cetera, number one. And then number two, for those around us, in whatever sense that or shape that takes, how do we also encourage people who may have never looked inside themselves to understand the way in which privilege impacts them, and start to chip away at this notion that the United States is a land of meritocracy, right? Because I think that's a large part to really get to the heart of the matter of what you're talking about. There's a lot of self-work that needs to be done even before you can think about, like, how do you empower an entire community, or how do you empower an entire group of people who may think differently from you?
Great questions. The myth of meritocracy has, I believe, been shattered if one looks at the facts. In a nation which has 400 years of slavery and did not provide reparations for slaves, I don't know how you can even say we're beginning at an equal starting point. In a nation where Native American people have been, I mean, destroyed, cultures destroyed, in a nation where we accept the genocide of Native American people. We accept, if you look at our Supreme Court cases going back to 1884, where we denied U.S. citizenship to a Native person because they were a Native person. We are starting with hundreds. We are starting at a baseline, which is not this. It's this. Can you see that on the video? Right? So on
Yes.
top of this, therefore, if you're starting this way, what does meritocracy mean? We haven't even made up for this difference here. We're not even trying to do that. And we are pretending that here's a topsoil of meritocracy. And if nothing else, for all, I think all of us heard about the college admission scandals, primarily in the West Coast, but that's going on, where rich parents were able to really, I mean, bribe, cheat their way into the system, and which revealed how even the best of universities and schools have a 10%, the dean's list, right? So like, if you look at the facts, and I know we're not living in a fact-based society anymore, unfortunately. If you look and just think about what I just said, and then think about women. Where in 400 years have we had equality for women? Whether you're talking about slavery or indigenous people, now there may be some pockets of communities, tribal communities, that were matrilineal. I cannot speak to that, but generally, women have also been subjugated. We got the right to vote recently. So how can we pretend, even if I know there's some cognitive dissonance, right? There is cognitive dissonance at this point, because the facts don't, if you think of the facts, they simply cannot hold the myth of meritocracy.
But I think this really gets to the heart of the matter of what you and I and people like us are really trying to change, right? In the sense of that all may be very well and true, which of course it is, but there is still people who, even though may admit all of those facts, but don't understand the way in which it really does impact them, right? In the sense of maybe shifting one's mindset to think, okay, so maybe I did have a little bit of help along the way, right? Like maybe I didn't work, maybe in addition to me working really hard to have what I have, maybe I did have quite a bit of help to get there, right? And so what is that mind, like what does that take in the sense of shifting that mindset?
I agree with that, and people think now. So let me just counter this with just again a fact, so that it answers directly the question. Have you read about the studies where there are two CVs, identical experiences? You change the name, one name on top is, and I'm going to take a white name. Let's hold race constant, Mary and John. Well, when a reviewer looks at John's CV, identical CVs, they give John higher points than Mary, both white. Then the other test that's been done, where you have identical CVs, the name implies race, a black name versus a white name. What happens? The white person gets reviewed, gets higher points, the same CVs. Now, what does that tell you? Now, presumably all of us have worked hard to get to where we are, but there are systems in place, and implicit, as you say, implicit bias. Those are implicit biases, right, that we have absorbed. Women have been the greatest carriers, I would say, equal carriers of a patriarchal structure. Right? Could patriarchy have survived? Could gender discrimination have survived if we were not discriminating against ourselves? And absorbing those values, which see women in a certain role. So I say this to you only to point out that, well, okay, all that hard work, but it also goes to what I say, what is the content of the values? What have we been taught, and how are we viewing the world? And you raised the good question that how do we start to deconstruct that? It's like unpeeling an onion, it's layers and layers, right? I think the first thing is, at a personal level, humility. I think it comes fundamentally from asking, why was I born where I was born? Do we know, is there an answer to why you were born where you were and you have the shape and color you have and I have? I don't think we know that. Do you? The amount of luck and the amount of some happenstance in that we cannot answer. That's a moment of humility.
Mhm.
And then I'd say that in the workplace and in everyday life, listening. I have found that to be the best way that I can check my privilege and hear other voices. And I have found that to be the most powerful way. And sometimes people have also said, and I have found this also, reading books, because it gives you time to absorb and reflect another point of view. Whether we're talking about Baldwin or Gertrude Stein, though I'm now taking issue with Jane Austen and having to deconstruct colonialism, racial privilege, that she simply does not address, and that women were all about marrying into money. So that's a whole other question. But I think listening, and I'd say in the workplace, particularly allyship.
Mhm.
And that power mapping, always power mapping.
I think it's also important as we think about everything of what's happened in 2020 for white people to have a different way in which they use their voices as well. And I keep thinking about, like, when you were just talking around kind of the importance of reading and taking time to absorb what it means. Cheryl Harris is a really good legal scholar who writes about whiteness as property, and Peggy McIntosh, Unpacking the White Knapsack, to really get at the heart of the matter of just given the sense that you're born into a white family, to your point, like, what are those privileges afforded to you, no matter what your economic class? Because I think that's sometimes the argument, is that working class white people often feel like the odds are already against them because they're really struggling, which is true. They're struggling. They're working really hard to put food on the family for their table, to try to get ahead, to achieve the American dream, but yet not cognizant and aware of the way in which white privilege and the race into which they were born still does afford them some privilege, right? And so it gets complicated when you start to think about race through then the socioeconomic lens. But still, right now in this country, there's an awakening that I really feel needs to happen, because all of the things that you're mentioning in the sense of what we can do as leaders, in the sense of empathy and listening, those are things that we're not seeing happening at the national level right now, in the sense of who's really truly leading this country. So then my question becomes, like, what do we tell our children, right? When we look to the top for leadership, no matter if it's a company or a nation, and we don't find the leaders that we want to have our children seek advice from or be inspired by, or aspire to become, what do we do? What's the next best alternative in those cases? Because we might have 4 more years of what we have right now.
My personal view as a mother is that this is an important moment to explain leadership for its sake is meaningless. Power for its power's sake is meaningless. It is about the content of your character. It is about, why do you want to be a leader? If you want to be a leader just for power, just to have power, enjoy it, and give it to people who have more power, to me, that is no value. But a value-based leadership and value-based living is what the world should be about. I say outright reject, as a parent and as an individual, this is leadership. I mean, the person is in a leadership role, but this is not what leadership is about. It's actually an example of what a leader should not be, a nation should not be. I mean, just as we're talking now, it strikes me, and I think, what about Nazi Germany, right? What now? There you had in Hitler a leader of a nation. What were people telling their children? Surely not that this is the model of leadership, that this leader personifies the values. Now, maybe they were. I would disagree fundamentally with that, by the way. So it is a moment to teach the importance of values and vision, and that's what justice and equality is about. And I am very thrilled to see that millennials and Gen Z are much more, as you can see the data, much more liberal, much more thoughtful about these issues. Gen Z in particular is living in the most racially diverse moment in our nation's history. By 2026, we will be majority nation people of color. Now, if we want to avoid apartheid, we have to do something about it, and we have to do it for women too. This is not just about, this is the intersectional life that so many of us lead in many different ways, right?
So that's interesting to hear you say that, because it makes me think of just 2020 in review, right? So we have the pandemic, we have 55, 56, 57 million Americans that filed unemployment claims. And we're seeing a rebound in some sectors and others not. We're seeing, a halting of many benefits that were available to individuals and to small businesses. And so we still have yet to see then how that trickles down and affects everybody by year end. And, we have, just critical shifts in the way that we communicate and relate to each other as human beings. And so it literally has touched every aspect of our world, professionally and personally. And when you talk about values, I can't help to think about how subjective that word is in even of itself, right? And so we may strive for a values-based life, but if my values don't align with your values, playing devil's advocate here a bit, like who's to say whose values trump the others? Not to use Trump in that sense, but to, you know what I mean? It came out of my mouth and I'm like, oh, that's not quite the point I was making. But how do we assess really, truly what values take priority over others' values? And in what role should law and science play into how we really think about moving forward?
Great question. I'm going to come back to you. I think that values, all words are so subjective. Beauty, power, these are all subjective. There is no such thing as an objective word. Even science has been biased, right? When you think about the biases, who was encouraged to study science, who have been the subjects of science, where have these topics come from? There is no unbiased, because we are human beings, we see everything through our eyes and we live through this experience, right? So to me, maybe one begins with one's humanness. Okay, there is no, what about that? Begin with humanness and respect for all people. And ask what that means and how that translates. To me, it translates into a set of values that I have articulated, right? But it will, if we come from the place of respect for all, our humanness, and the short period that we know of human life, it should raise questions about what is the meaning of this life, right? And our life together for the short period that we are together.
I want to jump to a different theme for a second, but definitely there's a lot of linkages and correlations to what I'm about to ask and what you just said. The theme of ecofeminism. Talk to us a bit about what ecofeminism means to you, and why is this an important time to think about those intersectionalities a bit differently?
Nice change of topic, but it's always related, right? Because the idea of we are here on this planet, and it's very interesting, I feel like the roots of ecofeminism come from that sense of Mother Earth, right? And interesting, Mother Earth, Father Sky. I read that in Native traditions too, and it's like, I don't know how to deconstruct that further for this conversation, but the sense, I think Mother Earth, because the Earth is nurturing, it is the source of life, and I think that's like the fundamental. The women and men are the source of life, but women give, as we know from our work in reproductive justice and rights, that future generations come from our bodies. They require men, but they come from our bodies. So I think it's that analogy to the earth, right? That we come from the earth and we are of the earth. And that without respect for that, just as we want respect as women and we want to be able to live into our full role, whatever that might be, that is the fundamental basis, because this human life as we know it is based on this earth and this planet and the ecosystem that we live in. And it has not been respected. This is what the climate crisis is telling us, isn't it? At a very fundamental level. And to me, it's just encapsulates the inequality, the problems, this disrespect, and the need to accept our interdependence with the earth and us as people. It's like a parable that has so many different, so much symbolic value, and it really gets to the heart of the issue. It's a story right there.
I think it's interesting in this space right now that we're experiencing. There's still a debate about how serious COVID really is, and yet we know that 47 million women and children have become impoverished just during the time of COVID, just literally in the last 6 to 7 to 8 months, right? So just 2020. What does that mean then in the sense of what is our level of responsibility to really ensure that here in the US, we think of COVID as something much more than just the annual flu?
Oh, yeah. I mean, COVID has exposed how women, children, and communities of color are disparately impacted, right? To me, it should be a moment of awakening and crisis because, again, I think that I know when you have a fundamentally unequal system, any crisis that occurs within that structure is simply going to reveal all of those inequalities, right? And COVID has killed 1 million people worldwide. I just saw, and the United States is the country with the leading number of deaths. Now, these numbers, and look at the life that we're leading, right now. You and I are talking virtually. Look at the restrictions that everybody is talking about, how human life at so many countries around the planet has changed. Flu never did that to us. Now, the Spanish flu, yes, 1918. I don't know. I wasn't alive then. I don't know exactly what all the restrictions were. But this is another moment of that type of crisis that requires a reimagining here in the United States of what does it mean to have all those unemployed people? What about a healthcare system, by the way? I would think that this is a moment to be awakened to the need for a functioning healthcare system and to ensure that all of our people have healthcare. Healthcare should not be tied to employment because what does it mean for all those people who are unemployed? And in a time when people are dying of COVID-19.
Yeah, and when we think about, what could happen if the Affordable Care Act is reversed to pre-existing conditions, and we're learning more and more and more every day around, what are the longer term effects from long-term COVID survivors? And there's still so much that we don't know, but yet still so much from a healthcare perspective, not even tying it, in addition to tying it to whether or not you're employed, but then just tying it to what kind of healthcare do you have access to? And if you have a pre-existing condition and have to find a new plan, then that opens up a whole different can of worms.
And you also know that there's a correlation between COVID-19 and the rise of mental health issues. That again, and the fact that people with other health issues are not going into the healthcare system. We have a broken healthcare system in our country. And it needs to be fixed. And the affordable healthcare was just one step in the right direction. But to have universal healthcare that is not tied to employment and really provide some basic level of care to all is crucial. Just like actually very similar to childcare. I get really upset when women internalize our system and think childcare is their personal responsibility. Yes, it is our personal responsibility, but the nation should be providing some basic level setting childcare.
I want to talk for a minute about the theme of reducing gender. And when we think about often race, class, sexuality, age, national origin, we think about you're either black or you're white, you're either male or you're female. So there's these binary constructs that you were alluding to earlier. And the notion that one woman, or one person of color speaks for the entire group. And no place is this better illustrated in the dangers of doing that with the fact that we lost RGB a couple of weeks ago now. And her replacement has very different views than what she advocated and fought for so many decades. Wanted to get your perspective on the ways in which we as a society still reduce gender and in what moments and times is it important to champion women, no matter what their beliefs, because we want to hold up the sisterhood and champion women who really excel and to progress in their careers or accomplish something incredibly personally. But then there's that inflection point where the support may feel counterintuitive or counterproductive to what you believe in, what your personal values are. And this, I mean, this obviously plays out so clearly just in this one example, but it's so striking in the sense that I can't tell you, for me personally, the times that it's come up so many different times, professionally and personally, throughout my career. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
It's a really important point you make, and it goes to the fact that we are all products of a sexist and racist society and system. So we all absorb to some level those that's where the implicit bias comes in. And so we get into this conversation about, and I've had this happen often, do you want to accept a right-wing woman, or let's say a man who is more supportive of women's rights, right? That's fundamentally like what you are crystallizing. And to what extent is the symbolic value of the woman leader more important than not having her? So like, and what I've seen in history, and especially recent history, because of the sexist societies we live in, like a Maggie Thatcher is the first person to be a female prime minister because her politics are not so revolutionary and she's more acceptable. That is how some of the breakthroughs happen for a group that is not in power. So the dominant group is more willing to accept a person from a non-dominant group who buys into their viewpoint, right? My view of those matters has always been that I want to see the concerns of women advanced. If they are not advanced by a woman, then I do not support that. I will support a man who advances our cause and the cause of justice. And that is just putting myself out, because I do not think that those women represent the values that I'm speaking to. So I'm not going to be blinded by that. I'm not going to be blinded by a Clarence Thomas. I'm not. And I hope that millions of us are not.
I think that's so very impactful and so very powerful, because it also is a reflection of how sometimes we value the individual over valuing the collective. And when you think about, the way in which this country was founded on individual rights, right to own property, right, which also meant, people, and, the right to bear arms, the right to free speech, those are all very individualistic freedoms and rights. And yet we often still to this day, which I really think that many of the issues that we have happening right now are precisely because we haven't shifted into the mindset of how do we really think about what's good for the collective, what's good for a group of people, as opposed to celebrating an individual.
Well, I'll say, Jan, my response to that is that the focus on individuals makes sense when you think of the ideology of a country where what happened to Native American people, and the enslavement of Black people. So when you were talking, how can you talk about the collective then? Because the collective was all this other, right? The them, and then sort of a bunch of white men in control and power. Not sort of a bunch of white men. Why did I say it that way? A group of white men in power. So talking about the collective in an expanded way would have led you very differently in terms of a political and social structure, especially when all these others were inferior and unequal. So were women, and of course, women didn't even have the right to vote. So it made much more sense to create sense to enable power. It's the power mapping I'm talking about. To create a political structure and a system based on individual rights, which were then initially limited to white men. And only a little bit over time, slowly, were we expanding that to power map to other groups, and we still have not achieved that. And that kind of collective holistic view would result in different outcomes and policies and law. right? A collective view that's concerned about health would take us more to sort of a European or Canadian universal health system, some basic standard of living for everybody. It would result in, when you're talking about women's specific concerns around childcare, though that should not be a woman's concern, it should be all of our concerns, some basic provision around that. What about education? We have also an unequal education system where, you know, the quality of schools is based on your tax base. So if you happen to, and we have that on top of separate but equal. It was only in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that we desegregated our schools. I mean, wow.
There's, oh my gosh, this is like a 3-hour show. There's so much to talk about here.
I bet you say that all the time.
No, but I think this conversation is so very important for me, just even personally, because look, like I spent 10 years of my career in the nonprofit world, and maybe this is a good segue into this this part of the conversation where, I feel like, NGOs have so much potential to do so much good work. And in some ways, Anika, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, I feel like sometimes the work we did felt like we were cleaning up the messes of others. And there's this feeling like, when you think about particularly the international NGOs, they're very they react, right? They react to natural disasters, they react to wars, they react to famines, they react to these other either man-made or not man-made instances where cleanup is such a big part of it, right? And so how do you really truly get beyond the cleanup aspect of what NGOs do to really ensure that all the things that you just mentioned actually come to fruition for others who are less fortunate and who others were born into extreme hardship conditions? What does that look like? And particularly now, given the fact that this is the new state of COVID.
There can be no simple answer to that set of extremely complex questions. I guess I begin with some foundational principles. And that first one I ask about the sort of international NGO world is, to what extent it reflects colonizing principles in a post-colonial world. And in any organization that I would say has that like white savior kind of view is problematic. Whereas if we come at this from the basic point of, I think, the value that our liberation is tied together. I am not free if you are not free. And to understand that we are in this, that is a principle for feminism. It is a principle around race, our collective liberation, collective solidarity. And I'm not, it depends on which organization we're talking about. But I think it's very important to start from that basis, because that then, if you start with that and strive to live into that, it changes what you do, how you do it. And it builds on partnership, because you cannot talk about collective. It goes back to that collective, remember, we were talking about, sense of joint liberation. And it requires a different kind of partnership. It is not one telling others, this is what we ought to be doing. But then how do we collectively solve? And how can I help you, address the issue of poverty? And how do I ensure that your voices are being heard? Because I wonder now, as I believe in human rights as fundamental principles. Now, how you implement, who speaks, how you figure out how to change systems is going to be locally specific, right? It's not going to be the same whether you're the United States, even Alabama versus California. Forget US versus China, not versus, I mean like US, Africa, or China. It's going to be different. And so I think to allow for that difference and not to let and this is very difficult because there's funding, your funders would have to be aligned with this point of view, and not everybody is. So there's a lot of education also to be done, and re-education.
Piggybacking from there, you wrote a couple of years ago that there was a diversity leadership deficit in the nonprofit world. That was in 2017 when you wrote that. We're now in 2020. Have you seen improvement in that space, just in the sense of how diversity and inclusion is reflected into leadership ranks within the nonprofit world? And knowing that it's probably different depending upon the organization and the mission and the fundamental ways in which it was formed, to your point earlier. But what's happened in the last few years? Do you see that nonprofits have risen to the challenge of ensuring that there's leadership that really truly reflects the communities in which they serve?
The diversity gap in the nonprofit world exists and continues. It's actually pretty astonishing, but 3 years is not a lot of time. So it's not like things are going to change. But I will say that around racial diversification, we are in a unique moment. That things, we were talking about this, that with the protests, with a global focus of Black Lives Matter, I see the momentum, the push for change, and the openness to do it in a way that I have never seen it in my career. And what I'm really pleased to see is that our Black colleagues are speaking out, and we are trying to create an ecosystem where we listen to them. And it's that power mapping. Right now, I've been used to walking into rooms and wondering, why am I the darkest person in this room? I know the answer, really. But the question was, how was I going to change it, and how do I name it and do it in a way that changes that room?
I'm also wondering, I remember when I was the CFO of International Planned Parenthood many, many, many moons ago now. When I first started, out of our entire $34 million operating budget, about 75% of that budget was unrestricted, meaning that donors would give us monies and those monies could be used for whatever way that we saw fit. By the end of my tenure, 6 years later, it was 180 degrees flipped, where 75% of our budget was restricted by donors, 25% unrestricted. And that did a few different things. And this happened during the moment in time that the IRS recalibrated the way in which nonprofits must report their taxes, right? So the 990 form, which is the tax return for those of us who don't know, tax return that nonprofit organizations have to file, was completely revamped in the spirit of having more transparency and a higher level of governance, in the sense of ensuring that monies are being used according to how they're supposed to be used. I'm wondering if this is also a time where corporate funders, grant makers, foundations could also have a different lens of oversight to hold boards and management of nonprofits accountable for insisting that there's more diversity and inclusion at all different levels of an organization, in the same way that they were in the spirit of financial transparency a few years back.
Absolutely. I think that's great. And I'm glad you raised this point, Jan, and hopefully there are audience members who can utilize those leverage points. I absolutely feel that it's important for supporters to rise and add to the call for diversity, equity, and inclusion, to ask for transparency around numbers. And that means who you are hiring, what is their power in the institution, what is their budgetary resource. And I would also say that it is important to trust nonprofits to some extent to give unrestricted funds, because restricting funds starts to then, it actually gives ultimately the largest funders most power, and it limits the choices that the leadership of a nonprofit can make. And with more unrestricted funds, the investment in diversity, equity, and inclusion can occur, and greater transparency. Because now we are seeing, actually, by the way, that for certain funders, usually institutional funders, will ask about the racial makeup of your organization. There's a lot more after that too. Pay equity, promotion, a lot more to be done to structurally change who is at nonprofits, because it's about recruitment too. It's about training. It's about creating an inclusive environment. There are areas of study and work, professional life devoted entirely to this. And how do you use all of what we have available to us to advance racial equity. And what do you need to change? It's a mindset change too, right? Because nonprofits believe they're doing good work anyway. We're doing good work now. What you and I, you're asking me to do this? What? How? Why? And to have the understanding that good work cannot be done if we're not including women, if we're not including people of color. Because if we're trying to change the world, then aren't we the best people to speak to these issues? And if we are trying to ensure that we have more Black colleagues in positions of power, we have to listen and be allies to our Black colleagues.
Anika, you've had an awe-inspiring career. You've led organizations so diverse in the sense of the overall mission, but yet understanding that there's the intersectionality of how it all fits together. I'm going to read them mostly in totality here, and I want you to reflect upon your 10 years with each of them. And when I'm done, I would love to get your thoughts on what was most memorable for you as you think back on your career trajectory so far. So you've led the Natural Resources Defense Council, Rainforest Alliance, Ms. Foundation for Women, Friends of the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and Center for Reproductive Rights. So obviously, it's, you care so much about the environment, about women and sustainability. But as you reflect upon your career, what's been most impactful for you in the roles in which you served?
Wow, that's a huge question. I think my biggest takeaways are that we have to keep fighting. There's never been anything but that. Keep fighting for that vision of the world that we want, a world of equality and justice. And that fight also involves sometimes not speaking, but ensuring that the right people are in the right spaces. Fight is not just about, because if I'm fighting and my voice is loud, well, that could be hurting the broader cause. And so I see my role more and more as being about people, getting the right people's voices heard, getting the right people in the right spaces. That is the single, if there's only one big takeaway, it's that. And knowing that social change is not linear. Oh, year one, 5% change. Next year, 3%, all improving this way. But that social change has a cycle and it's life. And we have to keep our vision, that dream alive. And that is, and it may take 100 years, but that dream and the people who advocated have to be nurtured and their voices have to be heard. That's my single biggest takeaway.
And again, that involves really thinking through how we can contribute as activists in different ways, right? Because when I think about in my early days of being a social justice activist, I certainly was not thinking through the framework in which you just discussed. But I think that there's an incredible amount of power by shifting that mindset. And it's a subtle mind shift, but it results in huge net impact in a way that then also bears the question then, do we need to measure progress through a different lens? Like, do we need to have different measurements by why? And I think about, working in the nonprofit sense and, how we report to, USAID or UNFPA or, and it was a very different set of metrics that don't necessarily fit within the framework by which you're describing now. So what will it take for us to really think through not just how we show up differently as individual contributors, as a part of a larger collective, but then how do we ensure that we're also measuring progress in a way that's really aligned then with what we're espousing as our values to be?
Measuring progress is really important, and we need to develop those criteria and indicators ourselves, and we need to talk about it in the external world. We may need to educate funders, institutions, because what we are learning is who is in the room, who is as important as what is done. In fact, who is in rooms determines what's done. And it is going to be a process of education. and re-education of all of us.
Anika, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. We have time just for 2 questions from our lightning round series, which is my favorite part of the show. If you were to describe 2020 in 3 words or less, how would you describe it?
There's got to be some kind of trick question. 2020. 2020 is a year in which we learned how much of the world we can't control and how we are subject to forces that we cannot even imagine. And yet, we have to live through it. And not just that, we have to speak up and feed ourselves and our souls and do right by us in the world.
That was beautiful and so appropriate for as we close out and launch into October. Final question for you. What advice would you give to your 85-year-old self today?
The advice I would give my 85-year-old self is, I would say, live a life that you are proud of. Live a life, again, those values. Live a life of dreaming if you need to dream, because the world around you is so ugly. But keep that dream alive and let that be something that sustains you as you go into the night.
Thank you, Anika. So beautifully said. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us today. I'm Jamrish Adams, the Vice President of U.S. Development with Join Mayshad. Please make sure to visit our YouTube channel, Join Mayshad, and our website, joinmayshad.com. See you next time, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Bye. Hello. Please make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit the bell to receive notifications of all of our content.